So some lessons learned from this very brief and quite positive history of wetlands is that it's important to take a look at your partners and advocates and think more broadly than in the past. Incentives and disincentives. I think there are a lot of incentives for developing in the floodplain, and I think that needs to be thought about carefully. Get people behind the ideas. We learned in wetlands that when public policy outstrips public support, your progress can come to a grinding halt, and you can have a very quick reversal of fortune. And the 1989 delineation manual is a good example of that. They got a bunch of scientists together to combine. There was a Corps manual, an EPA manual, an SCS manual, an Fish and Wildlife Service manual, all for identifying wetlands, all a little different. They had to have a facilitator to get them all to work together, maybe a mediator, I'm not sure. But what they didn't, well, I'm still not sure whether they realized what they were doing or not, but what happened when they combined all of those policies together is when they looked at the Corps manual said that normal circumstances was if you went out in a cornfield and it was wet but corn was growing, normal circumstances was corn was growing and it was a cornfield and it wasn't a wetland. And the SCS manual said if you went out in a cornfield and there was corn growing but you could see that you had hydric wet soils that were not fully drained, that normal circumstances would be what happened if you stopped planting corn each year, and if it would go back for a wetland, those were normal circumstances. The SCS definition of normal circumstances was adopted, and with one change, 60 million acres of land, farmland in the United States, was added to the definition of wetlands. This was too far, too fast. And so later on, there is now an exemption for prior converted croplands, which are not considered wetlands under the delineation manual. And there was a whole lot of other pain and anguish, including the 1990 delineation manual, which would have constrained the boundaries of wetlands far more than taking PCs back out. So an important thing to always be cognizant of is if you win the policy value battle, but you lose the public opinion battle, you will eventually lose the policy battle, or that's quite likely to happen. So keeping the public with you. And be careful what you wish for. No net loss is something to love and hate. And the outcome of no net loss is, I think for some of us, the ability to say no to wetlands fill and wetland alteration has been replaced. I'm not sure it ever existed, but it hasn't been pursued, because what's been pursued instead is this idea that we can move wetlands like checkerboards, checkers on a checkerboard all over the landscape. So we don't want a wetland here, we'll put it over here. We don't like that wetland here, we'll mitigate someplace else. And I think we have yet to find out whether that is going to be a wise policy or not. There's lots of reasons to be concerned about it, not the least of which with respect to flooding, because when you move a wetland with flood storage importance from one area in the watershed and you put it someplace else, some downstream folks win and some downstream folks lose. Some ideas. I think you could say that 2010 is perhaps similar to 1988 for wetlands. There is a lot happening and a lot of opportunities to affect national flood policy. I mean, you can see the list here. You may have other things on your list as well. And just at the bottom here, number 7, the Farm Bill, this administration is planning to fully implement the Wetlands Reserve Program and double or triple the number of acres enrolled in it over the next 3 years. So this is a big push. And much of that restoration is obviously going to happen in floodplains, if Rob Wood's 80% number is in fact correct. You could do something like the Goldstein report, doing a study or to look at what the incentives are that lead to destruction of floodplain functions and values is certainly something that's very doable and something that could be pursued. Identifying new partners and advocates. In the previous presentation, there was some discussion about finding exactly the right terms and getting everybody to buy on. What I would advocate for is finding a few key ideas and let people sort of take them and morph them into what the conservation community is interested in, or the environmental community, or the flood risk reduction. But if we have some basic ideas and concepts that we're going to work through all these opportunities to affect policy and try to be consistent in the overall idea, I'm personally am not as concerned about exact words being consistent. And natural floodplains, or natural and beneficial floodplains, I'm not sure that there's agreement on how we would map that. Is it the 100-year flood? What functions are you mapping for? Is it flood storage? Is it wildlife? Is it fisheries? Is it sediment deposition? There's a long list, and I don't know if we want to start on mapping natural floodplains or not, or we want to maybe piggyback onto other kinds of wetland mapping and other things that occur. But you know, that ability to say this is what we're losing each year somehow, the way that was done with the wetlands program, would be a valuable thing to use, because we have no way of quantifying the loss of the natural and beneficial values of the floodplain. A number of the papers that we all got a chance to review prior to the symposium pointed to the need to reconnect rivers with floodplains. I think that this is a problem not solely for water quantity and flood hazard reduction. It's a huge problem for water quality. The largest part of our water quality problems in the country are, as we know, non-point source problems, and a lot of that sediment transport that's creating that problem is coming right out of the bottom and the sides of rivers and streams, because they've been separated from their floodplains. And we don't know how to do this. I mean, you know, because rivers are not associated with their floodplains, so the idea of going to the Army Corps of Engineers and suggesting we need to fill the river so that the water is higher and will overflow into the floodplains is something that would be, at a minimum, extremely challenging to do at this point in time. But this is the kind of, you know, sort of alternatives or new kinds of science that need to be explored, need to be researched, and need to be pursued. And it builds on a lot of work that's already being done. And so the last point here is I think that language is a huge barrier to communicating with the public. And there's a lot of folks that have written about this. But natural and beneficial values of the floodplain, I mean, you can imagine, who is it, the late night host that goes out and interviews people to see if they know about stuff? You know, so if you went down on the streets in New York City and you stuck a mic in front of somebody, you said, well, what are the natural and beneficial values of the floodplain? I have no idea, but I doubt it would be the list that I showed you earlier on. And if the public doesn't understand what we're talking about, then we're not going to attract those other groups that we know have similar interests and similar goals to what we have.